The bus ride home from the library left me aching. My hands shook as I held the strap of my bag, the same dull tremor that had followed me for weeks. By the time I stepped onto the wet pavement in front of my parents' house, the fog rolling in from the Oregon coast seemed to press against my chest. I had worked through worse years of shelving books, sorting returns, answering questions I could barely hear anymore, but today I knew I had to speak. Inside, the lights glowed warm, and for a moment I almost let myself believe I was coming home to safety. My mother, Miriam, was at the stove stirring soup. My father, Gerald, sat in his chair by the window with a folded newspaper. I set my bag on the counter and said it as gently as I could. I think it's time I leave the library. My health isn't what it was. I need to rest. The spoon froze mid-air. Miriam's shoulders stiffened. Gerald lowered the paper slowly, his jaw tightening as if he had been waiting for this. "If you don't pay, you don't stay," he snapped. The words were loud, final, like a door slamming. The air between us shifted. I had spent months under their roof since Raoul passed, believing I had a place here, believing blood was enough. I thought of the nights I stretched Raoul's tugboat wages and my library paychecks to buy our own small house decades ago. That house had been proof of everything we endured together. Now, standing in my parents' kitchen, I realized even history meant nothing. To them, I was just another mouth to feed, another bill to split. I didn't argue. I only gripped the counter to steady my hands, already knowing that silence would not protect me this time. The next evening, I found a sheet of paper waiting on the kitchen table. My mother had drawn neat columns with a ruler, each expense listed in careful handwriting: electricity, water, groceries, internet, taxes. The numbers were tallied with precision, divided evenly into 3 portions: hers, my father's, and mine. Gerald sat across from me with his reading glasses low on his nose. He tapped the page as if it were a courtroom exhibit. This is fair. Everyone contributes, or the system collapses. My name was written at the top of the 3rd column, squeezed between figures for utilities and food. One line among many, reduced to decimals. I stared at it until the numbers blurred, hearing only the faint hum of the refrigerator. Memories pressed in. Raoul working double shifts on the tugboats, the salt on his skin when he came home too tired to speak. Me at the library, stretching coins until they bent, sewing clothes late into the night so Clara could have shoes that fit. Each sacrifice laid brick by brick into the house we bought in San Miguel. That house had been proof that our sweat and silence could build something lasting. But sitting here now, the sacrifices were invisible. I wasn't a woman who had built a life. I was a debtor in my parents' account book. I folded the paper carefully, sliding it into my bag without a word. Arguing wouldn't change the ledger in their minds. Numbers had already replaced memory. That night, I lay awake listening to the creak of the old house. I knew I would not sleep. When the silence grew too heavy, I reached for my coat, ready to walk into the damp Oregon night, searching for air that didn't carry the weight of balance sheets. The streets glistened under a thin film of rain as I walked toward the river. The air carried the sharp scent of salt and metal, the kind that clung to Raoul's jacket when he came home from long shifts on the tugboats. Each step echoed in the quiet night until I reached the Columbia River locks. I leaned against the railing, watching the dark water surge and recede against the gates. It was here, on quiet Sunday evenings, that Raoul used to bring me when we were first married. He would point toward the waiting fishing vessels and whisper, "Patience, Evelina. We'll earn our place. One shift at a time." His faith had been unshakable, his certainty contagious. Together we had believed the future could be built with calloused hands and quiet endurance. But now, standing in the damp night air, I felt the cost of that endurance pressing on me. Silence had been my armor, my way of keeping the peace in my parents' house. just as it had been in harder years with Raoul when every penny counted. Yet peace, I realized, had come at the price of erasure. Each day I faded a little more into the walls, until even my parents could look at me and see only numbers on a ledger. The water below churned, restless, a mirror to the resolve forming inside me. I would not let silence erase me again. If I had to draw a line, I would. If I had to rebuild alone, I could. I pulled my coat tighter and turned from the river, the sound of gulls crying overhead. By the time I reached the house again, the decision had already settled deep within me. Tomorrow, I would climb into the attic and search for what remained of the life Raoul and I had fought to build. Morning light seeped weakly through the curtains when I pulled down the attic ladder. Dust drifted in the air, carrying the scent of cedar and old paper. The boards creaked under my weight as I stepped into the dim space where decades of our lives lay stacked in cardboard boxes. I knelt beside one marked house documents in Raoul's neat handwriting. My hands shook as I lifted the lid, but not from weakness this time. Inside were yellowed mortgage receipts bundled with twine, each slip a reminder of nights we'd chosen beans and rice so Clara could have proper shoes for school. There were tax statements, grocery ledgers, scraps of envelopes where we had scribbled numbers when calculators broke. Every line was a record of choices made in silence, sacrifices invisible to anyone who never lived them. Beneath the receipts, I found a long envelope labeled Trust. My breath caught as I unfolded the crisp papers. Raoul's signature stretched across the bottom, naming me the sole trustee of the house and savings. Savings bonds long matured, a certificate of deposit ready for withdrawal, and the deed itself our home, paid in full since the year 2000. He had planned for this, for me, ensuring I would never be forced to depend on anyone, not even family. I sat cross-legged on the floorboards, the envelope spread across my lap. For a long time I let the weight of it settle inside me. Every number here told a different story than the spreadsheet my parents had placed on the kitchen table. Their ledger reduced me to a cost. This one testified to decades of resilience, of love that worked itself raw so we could stand on solid ground. I slid the documents carefully back into the envelope, pressing the flap closed with steady fingers. These were not just papers, they were proof that silence had always carried more power than anyone guessed. And now, that silence would become my answer. I carried the box down the ladder, already knowing I would keep it close. Soon, I would need every line it contained when the next demand arrived across the kitchen table. By Saturday morning, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen, though it did little to soften the edge in the air. My father sat at the head of the table with his arms crossed, while my mother slid a folder toward me. Inside were several pages neatly highlighted in yellow. "I drafted this so there's no confusion," Miriam said, her tone clipped and professional, as if I were a tenant rather than her daughter. I picked up the first page. The heading read, Domestic Contribution Agreement. Line items were listed in bold: utilities, groceries, household taxes, internet. At the bottom, a figure $900 each month. Beneath it, a blank line waited for my signature. I read through the pages slowly. My face still... There was no mention of the 40 years I had worked, or the house Raoul and I had paid for in full. No acknowledgement of the countless nights sewing hymns by lamplight, stretching coins so our family could stand tall. Only numbers, cold and exact. Before I could speak, small footsteps padded into the kitchen. Sophie, my 10-year-old niece, leaned against the counter in her pajamas, hair tangled from sleep. She peered at the papers spread before me and asked in a clear, curious voice, "Why would Grandma have to pay for Grandma's house?" The room went silent. Miriam's cheeks flushed. Gerald shifted in his chair but said nothing. The weight of Sophie's question filled every corner of the kitchen, sharper than any argument I could have made. I folded the contract neatly and placed it back on the table. "I'll need time to think," I said softly. Sliding the pages aside, My hands didn't shake as they once had. I had already decided where my answer would come from, and it wouldn't be written in their ink. That afternoon, I carried the contract upstairs and tucked it into the desk drawer beside Raoul's old fountain pen. I sat there for a long time, staring at the pen, remembering how he used to sign each check slowly, as though every stroke carried the weight of our future. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I had saved months earlier, Valeria Cruz. Realtor. I had met her at the market. Her card slipped into my hand after a polite conversation about property values in our neighborhood. At the time, I hadn't thought I would ever use it. Now I typed a short message. Call me Monday morning. Subject: the house next door. My thumb hovered for a second before pressing send. When the message went out, I felt a calm I hadn't known in weeks. On Monday, I walked down the main avenue to Valeria's office. The air smelled of wet cedar after the rain. She greeted me with a warm smile and gestured toward a chair by the window. I received your message, she said. Opening her laptop. Are you ready to sell? I shook my head. Not sell. Buy. The Vargas house next door. I want it in my name, and I want it without financing. Her eyebrows lifted. Are you serious? I slid an envelope from my bag and placed it on the desk. Inside were the matured certificates and savings bonds Raoul had left me, proof of funds clear as daylight. I can cover a cash offer. I told her I'll accept inspection, but I waive appraisal. I want a clean deal and a quick close. Valeria glanced over the papers, her expression shifting from surprise to respect. With these terms, they'll pay attention. Let's draft the offer. I sat straighter, feeling the weight in my chest ease for the first time. One hedge away stood the key to freedom, and I was ready to claim it. 2 days later, Valeria met me outside the Vargas house. The paint on the shutters was fading, but the structure stood solid against the morning light. She unlocked the door, and we stepped inside. The air carried a faint scent of cedar from the exposed beams that stretched across the ceiling. Sunlight poured through the south-facing windows, casting warm bands across the worn hardwood floor. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the steady grain beneath my fingertips. And for a moment it was as if Raoul were beside me again, steadying the ladder while I painted Clara's bedroom sky blue all those years ago. We moved through the kitchen, dated but sturdy, and into the backyard where a detached garage stood, weathered but strong. I could already see it transformed Sophie's drawings tacked along the walls, Emile kicking a ball in the grass while I baked inside without anyone questioning what I owed for flour or sugar. This one won't last long on the market, Valeria said. Flipping through the seller's packet, they're asking 15 million pesos, which is about 850,000 U.S. dollars. But if we go in with 16, cash, clean terms, we'll have their attention immediately. I didn't hesitate. Do it. Cash offer. 5-day inspection, 2-week close, no appraisal. Her pen moved quickly across the draft contract, and when she handed it to me, I signed without trembling. The weight that had pressed against my chest for weeks seemed to lift as the ink dried on the page. By that evening, Valeria called to confirm the sellers had accepted. The deposit was opened, the funds wired. For the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me firm and certain. Not borrowed, not conditional. The walls I would soon walk into would carry my name, not my debt. The following Saturday, my parents called me back to the kitchen table. The same manila folder lay open, new pages clipped neatly together. My father cleared his throat while my mother pushed the papers toward me as if sealing a business deal. This version includes insurance and maintenance. She said, it's not much. Evelina, it's only fair. I studied the black ink and tidy columns, a signature line waiting at the bottom like a trap. My pulse stayed steady. When I looked up, I let my voice fall quiet. You're right, I said. I won't live here without contributing. Relief flickered across their faces, but before it could settle, I reached into my bag and set a small brass key on the table. Its teeth caught the light, bright against the dull paper. "I bought the Vargas house," I said evenly. "I'll be moving in 2 weeks." The silence that followed was deeper than any argument. My father blinked hard, his mouth opening then closing without sound. My mother's hand trembled against the folder, color draining from her cheeks. I slid another document from my bag. 1 page with simple terms. "This house remains in trust. You may stay under a license I control 90 days' notice. Utilities in your names from now on. Ownership does not change." My voice carried no anger, only finality. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, but silence had always been my strongest line of defense. Now it was also my weapon of clarity. I folded the page and left the key glinting between us. For the first time, I felt the balance of power shift back into my hands, steady and undeniable. The first utility bill arrived a week after I handed them the key. My mother opened it at the counter. Her lips pressed tight as she read the numbers. My father muttered under his breath, folding the paper into sharp creases before setting it aside. By the next month, there were more envelopes stacked near the fruit bowl, each one heavier than the last. Their frustration grew loud enough to hear through the walls at night. Neighbors stopped me on my walks to the market, glancing between the 2 houses. "Why the move?" "Evelina," they asked kindly, though their eyes searched for cracks. Before I could answer, my mother often spoke first, her voice brittle. "She just needed more space," she said, forcing a smile. The words rang hollow, and the neighbors nodded politely, but with doubt. Meanwhile, Sophie and Emile found their way to my porch more often. Sophie arrived with her backpack slipping off one shoulder, asking if she could do homework at my kitchen table. Emile followed soon after, a soccer ball tucked under his arm, wanting to practice in the yard. They didn't need to explain. Their presence spoke louder than any excuse. I welcomed them in, setting cookies on a plate, reminding them to finish assignments before play. Their laughter filled the small rooms, echoing against walls that seemed to breathe easier than the ones next door. Here, there were no ledgers on the table, no voices sharpened by numbers, just the quiet rhythm of pencils scratching, the thud of a ball in the yard, and the comfort of belonging. One evening, as I packed Sophie's homework into her bag and brushed crumbs from Emile's shirt, I knew the truth had already shifted. It was nearly dusk when I heard the knock. I opened the door to find my mother standing there alone, her shoulders slumped, her eyes red-rimmed. She stepped onto the porch without the confidence she usually carried, hands twisting together as if they no longer knew what to do. "I told myself it was care," she whispered, staring at the floorboards, "but it was control. I didn't want to see it until now." Her voice cracked on the last word. And for the first time in years, she looked less like the mother who had dictated every rule and more like the woman who once braided my hair before school. I let the silence stretch until she finally lifted her gaze, trembling. "I don't want to lose you. Evelina, tell me how to make this right." I stepped inside and returned with a plain folder. Inside was a simple 6-month lease, written in clear terms. The rent was set below market, not to profit but to remind us both that boundaries must exist. At the bottom, no hidden conditions, no fine print, just a single line that required respect. I slid the folder across the small table on the porch. "This is it. No more ledgers, no more contracts designed to erase me. Cross this line and the arrangement ends. Respect it. And we begin again." Her hands shook as she reached for the pen. Tears traced down her cheeks as she signed her name, each stroke heavier than the last. When she pushed the folder back to me, her shoulders eased, and I saw something fragile return to her face, something like humility. I closed the folder carefully, knowing the balance had finally shifted for good. The weeks that followed slipped into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. From my porch, I could see the glow of lights across the hedge each evening, steady but no longer heavy with tension. Some nights dinner was at my table, the children's laughter rising above the clink of dishes. Other nights I carried a casserole next door, where the mood had softened, conversations slower and more careful. Sophie and Emile moved freely between yards, their backpacks tossed onto whichever porch they chose that day. They seemed lighter, too, their voices unburdened, no longer caught in the sharp edges of unspoken arguments. Boundaries, once resisted, had become the foundation for something steadier. My parents no longer pushed contracts across the table. Bills were theirs to manage, as they always should have been, and respect, though new and fragile, began to take root in our exchanges. One evening, I sat at my desk with Raoul's fountain pen beside me and opened my journal. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of children's laughter drifting through the window. I wrote the words I had carried inside for too long. Love isn't measured by what you pay, it's measured by respect. I closed the journal and set it next to the lamp. For the first time in years, I felt that both houses, separated by a single hedge, could finally hold a peace that had nothing to do with ledgers, when money no longer defines belonging. What does family truly cost?